All right, so we're going to describe the key features of each of the functions. So we have two graphs. We have f of x and g of x. So for the first graph, f of x, we're going to use the equation f of x equals 2 to the x power. So we're starting our exponential functions. So all of our exponential functions, we can use the equation y equals a times b to the x power. Make that a little bit darker. So the equation y equals a times b to the x power. So for our exponential growth equations, our b value is greater than 0. So in this equation, the b value is equal to 2, and 2 is greater than 1, which means our graph is representing exponential growth. So we're going to identify a couple of the key features. So we're going to identify the domain, the range, the y-intercept, and the asymptote, which we're going to talk about what that means today. So in the beginning of the year, we talked about the domain of a function. So the domain, I'm going to use a highlighter, so if you want to grab yourself a highlighter as well. The domain are all of our x values. So we have to find the lowest x value, which is over here, and the highest x value, which is over here. So I'm going to highlight the lowest and highest x values in yellow. So notice that this arrow looks like it stops at -5, but the arrow keeps going, so the domain actually doesn't start at -5, it starts at -infinity because the right arrow or the left arrow goes on forever. And then same thing for the right arrow. It looks like it stops at +5, but the arrow means it keeps going on forever. So the domain stops at +infinity. So the domain for our exponential graph is -infinity to +infinity. It goes from left and right without stopping. So I'm going to change my color and I'm going to do the range in green. So the range is the lowest y value. So here's how low my graph goes. And then the highest y value, which this is how high my graph goes. So it looks like the lowest number is at 0. It doesn't go below 0. So we start our range at 0. And then the graph does go up forever. It looks like it might stop at 30 in the picture, but that arrow, we know, keeps going on forever and ever, so it goes up past the 30. So our range doesn't stop at 30, it goes on forever, meaning the range is from 0 to +infinity. The graph never stops going up. Never stops going left, never stops going right, never stops going up, but it doesn't go down forever. It only stops at 0. All right, moving on. So our y-intercept is where the graph crosses the y-axis. So here's the point that we're going to label as our y-intercept. So that's at the point 0, 1. So if we were to do this in Desmos, we would be able to type in the equation and it would show us the y-intercept is at 0, 1. So we always write our y-intercept as a coordinate. All right, now the last thing is the asymptote. So this line right here, it's the line that the graph sits on top. So that line that the graph sits on top of, that's the line 0. So our asymptote is y equals 0. So I wrote it in green because I highlighted our asymptote on green. It's the line that the graph sits on top of. So here are all the key features that you need to know about the first graph. Okay, so for the second graph, g of x, we're going to use the function g of x is equal to 3 times 2 to the x. So looking back up here, we said that our equation was written in the form y equals a times b to the x power. So the first number is our a value, the second number is our b value. So in this case, b is equal to 2 again, and that should be correct because our graph is increasing. This makes our graph increase when it's greater than 1. So we're going to identify the domain, the range, the y-intercept, and the asymptote, just like we did for the first graph. So we'll start with the domain, and I'm going to highlight that in yellow. So we go from left to right. So here's my left arrow. Here's my right arrow. The arrows means it goes on forever. So our domain is negative infinity to positive infinity. Very good. So notice that the domain for 1 and 2 are exactly the same. Good job. All right, now let's do the range. So the range is from the bottom. So this is how far it goes down. This is how far it goes up, but that stops on an arrow, which means it's going to go up forever. It starts at 0. It doesn't go below 0, but it goes up forever, so it stops at positive infinity. So our range starts at 0, and then it goes up forever. So it stops at positive infinity, or it actually doesn't stop at all. So our y-intercept, that's the point that it crosses the y-axis on. So here's our y-intercept that we're going to label on the graph. And if we were to graph this in Desmos, we would see that the y-intercept is 3. So 0, 3. And something to notice is the y-intercept is actually just the a value. So that's something to remember because I can just look at that equation and know that my y-intercept is 3 since that's the first number. And then the last thing is the asymptote, which we said that's the line that the graph sits on top of. So the asymptote is at 0 again. So our asymptote is y equals 0. So notice the domain is the same. The range is the same. The y-intercepts are different, but the asymptotes are the same. So a lot of these answers are going to repeat depending on the equation and the graph that you're given.